Good Yontif, everyone, and Shana Tova, and welcome once again to my pre-recorded Rosh Hashanah sermon. I hope that all of you are having a good start to the new year, and I would like to apologize in advance for any inadvertent household noises that might find their way onto this recording. I also wanted to say that if you would like to have a conversation about any aspect of my talk today, I'd be very open to that happening. Thank you, and we'll get started. In the middle of the year 69 CE, the Jewish citizens of the Roman province of Judea found themselves in the midst of a multi-year military conflict with their Roman rulers. At that point, about 3 years into the so-called Great Jewish Revolt, much of Judea had been taken over by the Roman army, and the last stronghold for the Jews was the walled city of Jerusalem. Within those walls, two very politically different groups of Jewish inhabitants were not even close to being unified around how to respond to the Roman garrisons laying siege to their city. The central dispute between these two groups focused on whether to continue the battle against the Romans. Those in favor of continuing to fight were buoyed by the belief they would be able eventually to overcome the Roman army, whereas those who advocated surrender as the better option foresaw that the defeat of the city was likely and that the destruction of the temple that would surely follow soon afterwards. The pro-conflict group had the upper hand among the city's leadership, and they ordered that the gates to the city remain locked in order to prevent any surrender-minded residents from defecting and handing critical information about the city over to the Roman general. According to Talmudic legend, one of the leaders of the pro-surrender camp in the city was a well-known and respected rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai. He clearly saw that Jerusalem and the land of Judea as a whole would soon be entirely in Roman hands. With the support of his disciples, he came up with a bold plan to have them smuggle him out of the city in a coffin, since burial was the only exception to the rule preventing exit from the city. Once outside the walls, he was in a position to negotiate a deal with the Roman general Vespasian, in which he and his followers would be allowed to relocate to the small village of Yavne. It was here, as the story goes, that he would proceed to set up a rabbinical academy and lay the groundwork to preserve much of the richness of Jewish culture and assure the continuity of rabbinic learning and practice in the post-temple era. In retrospect, Ben Zakkai and those in his party were plainly on the right side of history. Not long after he had moved his students to their new location, the walls of Jerusalem were breached and the entire city, along with the Holy Temple, was completely destroyed, an event we commemorate annually with the observance of Tisha B'Av. However, the followers of Yochanan ben Zakkai not only preserved their own and their families' lives, but they transformed Jewish tradition in such a way that it was able to survive and even thrive across many centuries of migration and persecution. This narrative of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's decision to leave the doomed city of Jerusalem and begin a radically new chapter of Jewish life is often held up as the origin story of Rabbinic Judaism, which in some ways it may be. But it's also the quintessential example of many similar moments in Jewish history when members of the Jewish community made difficult choices requiring dramatic changes in their way of life in order to survive disastrous circumstances. I believe this story and others like it have an important lesson to teach us about the central challenge that we are facing in this generation. And when I say we, I don't mean to refer only to the Jewish community. Just as the Jewish residents of first century Jerusalem faced life and death decisions in response to the conflict with Rome, so too is the global human community today quickly awakening to the reality that we are facing our own growing set of life and death dilemmas, albeit on a scale and with stakes far beyond this ancient example. The most dramatic evidence for the stakes we are facing has shown up in the form of increasingly frequent and highly destructive weather events. Regrettably, it's not at all difficult to draw up a list of recent events of this type that as a group shed a disquieting light on our understanding of the health of the Earth's overall climate and its likely future evolution. In the last several months alone, we've heard about unprecedented heat waves in the Pacific Northwest. We are seeing wildfires of record-setting size and intensity, both here in the Western US and also in Southern Europe. There were historically destructive floods in places like Germany and Belgium earlier in the summer, and then, just last week, the same in New York City. We've seen the expansion and deepening of drought conditions both here in the US and in many other parts of the world. Even as these dramatic climate events have been unfolding in real time, we've come to understand through a series of recently released scientific studies that our species has entered what the Secretary General of the United Nations has called a code red situation in terms of the well-being of our planetary home. Not only is the global community falling short of its articulated goals from the Paris Climate Accords, but we now also know that the process of the planet heating up is accelerating beyond expectations, given current levels of atmospheric CO2. So how is it that we find ourselves faced with an ecological unraveling that, in the absence of radical measures of mitigation, will certainly lead to the collapse of modern civilization? How is it that our society has come to the point where young adults in record numbers are consciously and emphatically rejecting the idea of bringing children into the world out of concern for the suffering that will likely be visited upon them? One part of the answer has to do simply with historical momentum. Our civilization began following a path long ago that created the hope for many and the reality for some of material comfort and wealth at levels that had never existed before. The basis of this path of development reflected a set of assumptions about the inherent value placed on technological innovation and consistently increasing growth in economic and industrial productivity. On the other hand, this same perspective placed little value on the larger environmental and social consequences that typically resulted from pursuit of the productivity goals. We are by now familiar with many of these consequences: poor quality of air or water due to industrial pollution, disease in human and animal populations through exposure to hazardous chemicals used in agriculture or construction, the generation of vast amounts of non-biodegradable consumer waste that end up causing injury or death across many species of birds and fish. In classical economic theory, these larger consequences are generally not recognized as costs when calculating the desirability or profit potential of any new product initiative. Instead, they are categorized as externalities and swept under the proverbial rug. Today, we know that these consequences do have significant costs for society as a whole. They not only have long-term economic downsides, but more ominously, they have substantially destructive impacts on our collective life that go way beyond economic considerations. We are learning ever more clearly that the most destructive impact by far resulting from these excluded considerations is the generation of profound changes in our global climate system. These particular changes, driven by massive increases in atmospheric greenhouse gases, are already being felt by people living in many different locations around the world, including major population centers here in the United States. They are already causing significant damage, suffering, and loss of life, and these impacts are only expected to grow for the foreseeable future. We can anticipate that within a short span of years, the increasingly powerful effects of the climate crisis will literally make life untenable for a large proportion of the global human population. And it's certain that even those of us not directly impacted by these effects initially will be making noticeable adjustments to our lives as we are called to respond, hopefully with compassion and courage, to those who are. In the story of Jerusalem's destruction, we saw that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers were able to view their situation from a different angle than the competing group within the Jerusalem population. That group saw their only option as continuing the battle with the Roman forces, but ben Zakkai had before him a wider range of choices because his thinking had evolved with regard to what was necessary for Jewish life and culture to survive in a post-temple world. Today, we would call the process that he and his followers went through a paradigm shift. This phrase, paradigm shift, was originally coined by American philosopher Thomas Kuhn in the mid-20th century. In his use of it, it applied exclusively to the development of overarching frameworks or paradigms that define what is possible and rational to do in the quest to advance scientific knowledge. According to Kuhn, these frameworks hold sway until there is too much evidence that cannot be accounted for by the current paradigm. Such a situation at first usually inspires just a few intrepid individuals to strike out in a very different explanatory direction that better accounts for what is being observed within the community of scientists. If this group of scientific pioneers is successful, then their framework is eventually more widely embraced as the new accepted paradigm, at least until the process repeats itself further down the road. However, the most powerful insight from Kuhn's paradigm shift analysis is the degree to which the scientific community tends, regardless of the evidence presented, to initially resist embracing a new framework due to its deep intellectual and emotional investment in the current one. Very soon after Kuhn introduced this phrase within a specifically scientific context, many others began to apply the same idea to change processes in society more generally. It seems indisputable to me that our country and our world has been engaged in perhaps the most profound paradigm shift in all of human history over the past 2 or 3 generations. We have been slowly waking up to the rather horrific realization that many of our most basic assumptions about what constitutes a good and successful life are fundamentally flawed. This profoundly difficult paradigm shift is pushing us to recognize that the current status quo is, in fact, paving a road into a future where global human civilization and life on Earth more generally is at best significantly degraded, if not undermined, altogether. Philosophy professor Sean Kelly has an interesting and provocative take on the nature of this paradigm shift. He describes our world's current condition as analogous to undergoing a shared near-death experience. On the individual level, these processes often lead to a radical reframing of meaning and purpose in the life of the person so affected. So too, he argues, in the case of humanity as a whole, that such a dramatic confrontation with the potential end of our society might be necessary in order to catapult us out of our state of confusion and lethargy and into a new frame of mind and heart. Not surprisingly, our evolving perspective on this crisis has taken time to unfold and required many pioneering voices along the way. Each of these voices has called attention to the dangerous path we were on and helped to push our awareness towards the necessity of developing a new measure of well-being focused on sustainability rather than on growth as a primary goal. Rachel Carson was one such pioneering voice who wrote Silent Spring. Another was the Club of Rome that published an early landmark study entitled The Limits to Growth. And then there was Al Gore, who confronted us with An Inconvenient Truth. Bill McKibben has been a prolific voice in this conversation with many books and articles, as well as his important website, 350.org. And most recently, we've heard the courageous and galvanizing voice of Swedish teen Greta Thunberg speaking truth to power without reservation. All of these voices and many others have urged, cajoled, and ranted to the general public over the course of these past 60 years, warning us of the dire direction we were taking and pushing us to release our grip on the previous paradigm, which has more than outlived its usefulness. Given the amount of information and advocacy around the climate crisis, we might reasonably ask ourselves, why haven't we moved more quickly to address it? What's getting in our way? While we might place some blame on our own psychic attachment to the familiar and the comfortable, we need also to look squarely at the fossil fuel industry itself. Its deceptive and cynical approach is reminiscent of what we've seen from other major industries, such as the tobacco manufacturers and more recently the opioid producers. The major fossil fuel companies have for decades invested in, or maybe a better term is manufactured, their own research in order to deny and cast doubt on the growing consensus of human-driven climate change. Then, about a decade ago, as public awareness of climate change began to increase substantially, they changed their strategy. Taking an even more insidious approach, they created a public relations initiative that seemed to acknowledge the climate crisis. but they framed it in such a way that the focus was on individual Americans working to reduce the environmental impact of their own consumption patterns, rather than worrying about the behavior of the large oil and gas companies. Yes, you heard that right. The very concept of an individual carbon footprint was created in the offices of BP, ExxonMobil, and Shell Oil in order to distract us from the by far more important goal of bringing their operations to a standstill. In this way, they were able to falsely portray themselves as environmentally responsible, even as they proceeded with plans to invest in new fossil fuel production, thus further exacerbating the climate crisis. So in part due to the misleading messaging of this industry, the change in our understanding and our capacity to open ourselves to a new civilizational paradigm has come more slowly than it might have. The somewhat good news is that there are now small to moderate majorities of Americans who affirm the scientifically indisputable facts that climate change is occurring, that it's something to be concerned about, and that it is being driven by human activity. This is only somewhat good because it remains to be seen whether this shared understanding will translate into a willingness to get involved, to invest time, energy, and financial resources into lobbying and pressuring our formal leadership to take more decisive action in this arena. Environmental activist and scholar of Buddhism and systems theory, Joanna Macy, has for decades been one of the most compelling thinkers addressing the obstacles to moving towards a more sustainable future. Recognizing that engaging directly with the challenges that the climate crisis raises can feel emotionally overwhelming, she describes three distinctive responses, or three different stories, that people can choose to inform their stance towards this difficult reality. Two of these responses inhibit our capacity to take any kind of positive action. She names them the story of business as usual, in which we pretend things can go on as they are indefinitely, and the story of the great unraveling, in which we are immobilized by the fear that the damage is already done and we stand helpless in the face of the impending disaster. The third story, which for Macy is the only one that truly offers us any hope, she calls the Great Turning. In this response, we recognize the danger in which we find ourselves, but we also see and sense the possibilities to redesign the structures and systems that make up our society. In this framing or paradigm, we are open to drawing upon untapped wisdom and creativity so that the most detrimental potential scenarios are avoided and the future of life on Earth is nudged towards eventual stabilization and sustainability. For myself, and I fervently hope for a majority of people in our country and around the world, the Great Turning is the story I want us to live in and through. In Macy's thinking, the validity of the business as usual story has already been dismantled by facts on the ground. And while the validity of the Great Unraveling story is still theoretically intact, it nevertheless requires a greater suspension of disbelief than is the case with the Great Turning. So remarkably, the Great Turning is both the most hopeful and the most probable framing of the three options. And for our purposes, I would like to add that it's also the most Jewish. How so? Well, for one, our tradition at its best has been animated by the twin principles of pragmatic realism and the belief in the possibility of a more redemptive future. These were what motivated Yochanan ben Zakkai and his followers to engineer a way to leave Jerusalem when they saw its approaching downfall. And they have been the basis of Jewish survival across many centuries and difficult situations prior to and since those events. Even those that might have been termed hopeless by outside observers. The story of the Great Turning shares a dedication to these principles. We can find another linkage between the two in recognizing that today is the start of a special year in the Jewish calendar called the sabbatical or Shemitah year. As its English name implies, it comes around at the end of every 7-year cycle, and it represents a powerful environmental ethos from the biblical layer of our people's history. Among the practices related to this year-long observance are those which recognize that the land, the very earth with which we partner for food and other resources, has legitimate needs of its own for rest and replenishment. A failure to respect those legitimate needs leads, in the biblical context, to the natural and very dire consequences of being cut off from our partnership with the land. The story of the Great Turning also sees that the root of our current ecological crisis lies in our having moved from seeing ourselves as partners with the earth to seeing ourselves as its masters. A third point of connection lies in the essential value attributed to the cultivation of community. In traditional Jewish life, everyone understood that the goals of protection and survival, as well as joy and meaning, were unrealizable outside of the bonds of community. In the American context, this understanding and the commitments it demands have become weakened due to the competing ethos of rugged individualism. In the story of the Great Turning, too, we find that same emphasis on the reclamation of our interconnectedness, that it is an essential foundation for reimagining and rebuilding the kinds of social, political, economic, and environmental relations that will give us a shot at preserving a relatively life-sustaining planet for our descendants many generations down the road. So today, let us celebrate the birthday of the world, and let us mark the beginning of the Shemitah year by resolving to open ourselves more deeply to the story of the Great Turning, to the necessary shift in our paradigm of what it means to be human and living on planet Earth. We will need one another's support in the process of releasing our previous assumptions and contending with the enormity of the task that lies ahead. Let us commit to regular conversation and information sharing around opportunities to build our new culture of sustainability. And let us commit to adding our voices, our energy, and our financial resources to the growing chorus of communal activism towards ending our dependence on fossil fuels in an absolutely definitive way. At this historic tipping point in the history of our species, may we take in and be nourished by the words from the greatest ancient and the greatest modern prophet of our people. Chazak ve'amatz, may we be strong and of good courage. Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if we will it, it is no dream. May we all be inscribed for a good, sweet, healthy, and transformative year. L'shana tova, good yontif.